How does a fairy tale become a nightmare in a single night? For Nivara Solon, life was perfect. She had a loving millionaire husband, Caliph Draven, a breathtaking mansion, and was weeks away from welcoming their first child. But one rainy evening, the dream shatters. Kicked out, pregnant, and penniless, her only shelter is her car. This isn't just a story of a marriage ending. It's the story of a woman who was stripped of everything, only to discover a power her husband could never buy, and a resolve he could never break. The rain fell in relentless silver sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Atherton mansion. Each drop that slid down the glass felt like a tear for a life Nivara was about to lose, though she didn't know it yet. Inside, the air was thick with a silence that was heavier than any argument. Caliph stood by the fireplace, the flames casting flickering demonic shadows across his perfectly sculpted face. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at his reflection in the dark glass, a man admiring his own resolve. "I don't understand, Caliph," Nivara said, her voice trembling slightly. Her hand rested instinctively on the swell of her belly, a protective gesture that had become second nature over the past 9 months. The baby, their son, kicked gently, as if sensing his mother's distress. "A break? What does that even mean? I'm due in 3 weeks." Caliph finally turned, his gray eyes as cold and unforgiving as the storm outside. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her first car, yet he wore it with a casual indifference that screamed wealth. "It means, Nivara, that this isn't working. This arrangement." "Arrangement?" The word struck her like a slap. "We're married, Caliph. We're having a child. That's not an arrangement. It's a life. Our life." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't be naive. Everything is an arrangement. Our meeting, our courtship, this marriage, it was all predicated on certain understandings. Understandings you have failed to uphold." Her mind raced, trying to grasp what he was saying. Had she not been the perfect wife? She hosted his soulless charity dinners, schmoozed with the wives of his business partners, and turned their cold, architectural marvel of a house into a home. She had put her own art career on hold, her canvases gathering dust in the studio he'd built for her as a grand, empty gesture. She had done everything he asked. "What understanding have I broken?" she whispered, the fear now a cold knot in her stomach. "My world requires a certain aesthetic, a certain lack of complication," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "Your constant emotional needs, this impending disruption." He nodded towards her stomach. "It's become a drag on my productivity, on my focus." The cruelty of his words stole her breath. He was talking about their child as if it were a hostile takeover of his time. "He's your son, Caliph. Genetically, perhaps," he said with a shrug. "But he is a complication I am choosing to outsource." He walked over to the marble-topped bar and poured himself a whiskey, the clink of the glass decanter echoing in the cavernous room. "I've spoken to my lawyers. They've drawn up a separation agreement. It's quite generous, all things considered. You'll be well taken care of, provided you are discreet and cooperative." Nivara felt the floor tilt beneath her. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. He had planned this. The lawyers, the agreement, it had all been happening behind the placid facade of their life. "I don't want your money, Caliph," she said, a spark of her old fire returning. "I want my husband. I want the father of my child." "That man," Caliph said, taking a slow sip of his drink, "was a projection. A role I played to achieve a certain outcome. The outcome has been achieved. The role is no longer necessary." He placed the glass down and walked towards the front door, retrieving a sleek, black trench coat from the closet. "My driver will be here in 5 minutes. I'm staying at the city penthouse indefinitely." I suggest you make your own arrangements and be gone by morning. My security team will be here at 8 a.m. to change the locks." He didn't even look at her as he said it. He was looking at his watch. The finality in his tone was absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no space for tears or pleading. She was being evicted from her own life. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm 9 months pregnant. I have nowhere." He paused with his hand on the door, a flicker of something, annoyance, not pity, crossing his face. "You're a resourceful woman, Nivara. You were before you met me. I'm sure you'll figure it out." And with that, he opened the door and walked out into the storm, leaving her alone in the vast, silent house that had never truly been her home. The roar of his departing car was swallowed by the thunder. For a long time, she just stood there, her hand on her belly, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The life she had believed in was a lie. The man she loved was a monster. She looked around at the expensive furniture, the curated art on the walls, the cold, sterile perfection of it all. It wasn't a home, it was a stage set, and her part in the play was over. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. 8 a.m. He was serious. She looked at her phone. No missed calls, no concerned texts. Her life had been so intertwined with his that she had let her own friendships wither. There was only one person she could think of. One person from her old life, the life before Calith. With trembling fingers, she grabbed her purse and her car keys. She didn't pack a bag. What would she even take? Every dress, every piece of jewelry was a gift from him, a prop. She walked out of the front door, not even bothering to close it behind her, and got into the modest hybrid car she'd insisted on keeping, a relic of her former independence. She drove aimlessly at first, the wipers struggling against the deluge. The city lights blurred through her tears. He had left her, pregnant, alone, and discarded like a failed business venture. She pulled over into a dimly lit street, the engine humming quietly. She had nowhere to go. The rain hammered on the roof of the car, a lonely, rhythmic drumming that was the only sound in her shattered world. She leaned her head against the cold glass of the window, closed her eyes, and for the first time understood the terrifying, absolute nature of being utterly alone. Her mansion was a prison, and the world outside was a wilderness, and she was trapped between them. The inside of a Lexus RX 350 is not designed for sleep, especially not for a woman whose body is 9 months into the arduous process of creating another human being. Nivara woke with a gasp, a sharp pain in her lower back, and a crick in her neck that felt like a hot spike. The rain had stopped, but a damp, chilling fog had settled over the San Francisco streets, pressing against the car windows like a shroud. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the memory of Calith's cold eyes and colder words crashed back into her, and the pain in her heart eclipsed the physical discomfort. She was homeless. The word felt alien, theatrical. It was something that happened to other people in news stories, not to Nivara Solon, soon to be Draven, she had thought, wife of a venture capitalist titan. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale and puffy, her mascara smudged into dark circles beneath her eyes. She was wearing a silk blouse and designer jeans, a cruel joke given her circumstances. She was a caricature of wealth, a refugee from a life of luxury. Her phone buzzed in her purse. For a wild, hopeful second, she thought it might be Calith, calling to apologize, to say it was all a horrible mistake. But the screen lit up with a calendar notification. 10 a.m. Final walkthrough with nursery designer. A sob escaped her lips, raw and ragged. The nursery. She had spent weeks agonizing over the perfect shade of robin's egg blue for the walls, the sustainably sourced wooden crib, the mobile of hand-felted stars and planets. A perfect little universe for a child who would now be born into chaos. She had to move. She couldn't just sit here. She started the car, the engine a quiet hum in the morning stillness. Where to go? The thought of her parents in Ohio brought a fresh wave of shame. How could she tell them their successful daughter, the one who had made it, was sleeping in her car, cast out by her brilliant husband? They would be heartbroken, and their pity felt like something she couldn't bear. Then, one name surfaced again from the fog of her panic. Leora. Leora Vera was her best friend from her art school days, the maid of honor at her wedding, and a woman she had criminally neglected over the past 2 years. Their conversations had dwindled from weekly heart-to-hearts to sporadic texts. Leora ran a small, struggling coffee shop in the Mission District, a world away from Calith's Atherton Palace. She represented everything Nivara had left behind: authenticity, struggle, and a fierce, unpretentious loyalty. The shame of calling her was immense, but the alternative was unthinkable. She found Leora's number, and her thumb hovered over the call button. What would she even say? "Hi, remember me? My millionaire husband threw me out. Can I crash on your couch?" Before she could lose her nerve, she pressed the button. It rang twice before Leora's groggy voice answered. "Niv? Is everything okay? It's 6 a.m. "Leora," Nivara breathed, and to her horror, her voice broke completely. The tears started again, hot and unstoppable. "I'm so sorry to call so early. I need help." There was a rustling on the other end of the line. Then Leora's voice, suddenly sharp and awake. "Niv, what's wrong? Where are you? I'm in my car. Calith, he kicked me out." She said the words out loud for the first time, and they sounded both insane and devastatingly real. "He what?" The shock in Leora's voice was validating. "That son of a bitch. Okay, where are you right now? Tell me the street." Nivara looked out the window, her vision blurry. "I don't know. Near Golden Gate Park, I think." "Okay, listen to me. You're going to drive to my place. Do you still remember where it is?" "Yes," Nivara whispered. "Good. I'll buzz you in. Don't worry about parking. Just double park if you have to. I'll be waiting." Leora's voice was a lifeline, a warm, sturdy anchor in the swirling vortex of Nivara's despair. There was no judgment, no "I told you so," just immediate, unconditional support. The drive to the Mission felt like crossing into another country. The manicured lawns and silent, imposing mansions of Atherton gave way to vibrant murals, bustling bodegas, and the distant rumble of the BART train. It was loud and alive and messy, and for the first time in years, Nivara felt like she could breathe. Leora's apartment was a tiny one-bedroom above her coffee shop. The daily grind. The smell of roasting coffee beans and old books filled the stairwell. When Leora opened the door, she didn't say a word. She just pulled Nivara into a fierce hug. Nivara buried her face in her friend's shoulder and sobbed, letting go of the terror and humiliation she had been holding in all night. Leora's apartment was the antithesis of Calith's mansion. It was small, cluttered, and filled with personality. Books were stacked on every surface. Colorful weavings hung on the walls, and a half-finished painting stood on an easel by the window. It was a home. "He's a monster, Niv," Leora said, handing her a mug of steaming tea. "I never trusted him. He had the eyes of a shark." "I loved him," Nivara said, the words tasting like ash. "Or I loved who I thought he was." "You loved the story," Leora corrected gently. "The fairy tale. But the wolf was always there, honey. You just didn't want to see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the tea warming Nivara's cold hands. The reality of her situation began to sink in, not as a wave of panic, but as a series of practical, terrifying problems. She had no money of her own. Calith had insisted on a joint account that he controlled completely. Her credit cards were tied to his name. The car was in her name, a small mercy, but that was it. She had nothing. "What am I going to do?" she asked, looking down at her swollen belly. "I have a baby coming. I have nothing to give him." Leora put her hand over Nivara's. "First, you are going to sleep in a real bed. Second, you are going to eat something that isn't your own heart. And third, we are going to fight back." "Fight back? How? He has an army of lawyers. He's Calith Draven. He crushes people for a living." "Yeah, well, he's never met a pissed-off pregnant woman with nothing to lose," Leora said, a dangerous glint in her eye. "He thinks he can just throw you away? He has no idea who he's dealing with. You're not just some trophy wife, Niv. You're a survivor. You just forgot for a little while." Leora's words were a balm, but the fear was still a gnawing creature in her gut. Later that day, as she lay on Leora's lumpy but comfortable pull-out sofa, she tried to access her bank account online. Access denied. She tried her credit card to order some maternity clothes. Card declined. The efficiency of it was breathtaking. He hadn't just kicked her out, he had erased her. He had systematically severed every financial tie, cutting her off completely. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a siege. He wanted her to be destitute, to be powerless, to crawl back to him and accept whatever scraps he offered from his table. Lying there in the quiet of Leora's apartment, a new feeling began to stir beneath the grief and fear. It was small at first, a tiny, flickering ember. But as the hours passed, it grew brighter, hotter. It was rage. Pure, undiluted rage. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had underestimated her. And that, she vowed to the child kicking inside her, would be the biggest mistake of his life. The first week in Leora's apartment was a blur of sleep, tears, and cheap, comforting food. Leora was a fortress, deflecting the few calls that came through from Calith's assistant with a string of colorful Spanish curses and shielding Nivara from the world. But the protective bubble couldn't last forever. The baby was a constant, ticking clock, a physical reminder that she needed a plan, and fast. "You need a lawyer," Leora said one evening, placing a bowl of lentil soup on the cluttered coffee table. "Not one of those corporate sharks Calith keeps on retainer. You need a barracuda, someone who fights for the little guy." "How can I afford a lawyer, Leora?" Nivara said, gesturing around the small apartment. "I can't even afford to buy a onesie for this baby. Calith's locked me out of everything." "Many lawyers work on contingency, especially in divorce cases like this. They take a percentage of the settlement," Leora explained. "My cousin, the one who had that messy split last year, she used this guy, Thalen Morich. He's supposed to be brilliant, a real giant killer. His office is downtown. The idea of walking into a lawyer's office felt like admitting defeat, like formalizing the end of her marriage. But what was the alternative? Disappearing into poverty while Calith continued his ascent, unbothered and unburdened? The ember of rage inside her flared. The next day, dressed in a borrowed dress from Leora that barely fit over her belly, Nivara took the bus downtown. The journey itself was a lesson in humility. She, who had been chauffeured in a climate-controlled Maybach, was now deciphering bus routes and counting out change. Thalen Morich's office was not what she expected. It was in a historic, slightly run-down building with a creaky elevator and scuffed hardwood floors. The space was modest, filled with overflowing bookshelves and the distinct smell of old paper and strong coffee. It felt real, lived in. Thalen Morich himself was also a surprise. He wasn't a slick, pinstriped shark. He was a man in his late 30s, with a kind, weary face, rumpled sleeves, and an intensity in his eyes that was immediately reassuring. He listened to her story without interruption, his pen occasionally scratching a note on a yellow legal pad. He didn't seem shocked or titillated by the mention of Calith Draven's name. He just listened. When she finished, her voice hoarse, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. Draven's actions are, to put it mildly, reprehensible, he said, his voice calm and even. He's employing a classic starve-out tactic. He assumes that by cutting off your resources, he can force you to accept a lowball settlement offer to make the problem go away quickly and quietly. It's working, Nivara admitted, her voice small. I feel completely powerless. That's how he wants you to feel, Thalen said, leaning forward. Power is his currency. In his world, people are assets or liabilities. He's designated you a liability and is trying to divest. Our job is to prove that you are, in fact, his most significant asset, and that his liability in this situation is far greater than he imagines. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited within her. But how? He has the best legal team money can buy. He does, Thalen agreed, and they will try to bury us in paperwork, delay hearings, and bleed us dry. But they have a weakness. Their entire strategy is based on the assumption that you will break, that you will take the path of least resistance. We are not going to do that. He explained the legal landscape. California is a community property state, meaning anything acquired during the marriage should be split 50-50. This included the appreciation of Calith's company value, his stock portfolio, and, of course, the Atherton mansion. He'll fight it, Nivara said. He'll say I signed a prenup. Did you? Thalen asked, his gaze sharp. Nivara's mind went back to a whirlwind week just before their wedding. Calith had presented her with a thick document, calling it a formality. His lawyer, a cold woman with a reptilian smile, had been there. You should have your own counsel review this, she'd said, knowing full well Calith had given her less than 48 hours. Nivara, dizzy with love and trust, had just signed it. She explained this to Thalen, her cheeks burning with shame. Thalen nodded slowly. Coercion. Insufficient time for review, lack of independent counsel. We can challenge its validity. It's a fight, but it's a fight we can have. He paused. But a frontal assault might not be our best strategy. Calith Draven is a man who values his public image and his business above all else. A messy public divorce is not in his interest. We need to find leverage, something he wants to protect more than his money. His reputation? Nivara suggested. Exactly. And the multi-billion-dollar merger he's about to close with Sterling Nash. Nivara stared at him. What merger? Thalen slid a printout of a Wall Street Journal article across the desk. The headline read, Draven Capital nears landmark merger with Sterling Nash, creating tech investment behemoth. The deal was valued at over $3 billion. It was the culmination of Calith's entire career. The deal is contingent on a key person clause, Thalen explained, his voice low and strategic. Namely Calith. Any significant personal scandal, any hint of instability, could give Sterling Nash cold feet. They are a conservative old money firm. They don't like messes. The pieces began to click into place. The timing of it all. Calith hadn't just fallen out of love with her. He had been preparing for this merger. A pregnant wife, a messy divorce. It was a complication he needed to eliminate before closing the biggest deal of his life. She wasn't just a discarded lover. She was collateral damage in a corporate strategy. The revelation was sickening, but it was also clarifying. The fog of heartbreak began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about love or betrayal anymore. It was about business. And for the first time, Nivara saw a path forward. He has a hidden motive, she breathed, looking at Thalen. It was never about me. It's always about him, Thalen corrected. But his greatest strength, his ruthless focus on his business, is now his greatest weakness. He needs this to be quiet, and we are going to be very, very loud. He laid out the plan. They would file for divorce immediately, citing irreconcilable differences. But they would also file a motion for temporary support and exclusive use of the marital home, the mansion, pending the outcome of the divorce. They would subpoena financial records, not just personal ones, but records related to the merger. They would make her a central, unavoidable figure in the most important moment of his professional life. "He will retaliate," Thalen warned. "He will play dirty. He will try to paint you as an unstable, vindictive gold digger. Are you prepared for that?" Nivara looked down at her hands, then placed them on her belly. She thought of the cold night in the car, of the humiliation of her declined credit card, of the nursery that would never be. She thought of the child inside her, a child Calith had dismissed as a disruption. She looked up, and the intensity in her eyes matched Thalen's. "He has no idea what I'm prepared for. Filing the lawsuit was like firing a cannon in a library. The silence of Nivara's exile was shattered, replaced by the deafening roar of legal machinery grinding into motion. Thalen Moritz was true to his word. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a tactician. The initial filing was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It was dry, professional, and utterly damning. It laid out the timeline of the marriage, the impending birth of their child, and the sudden, brutal eviction, all in sterile legal prose that somehow made it feel even more chilling. Crucially, it included a motion for an emergency hearing to establish temporary spousal and child support, and to grant Nivara exclusive use and possession of the marital residence. It was a direct strike at the heart of Calith's power, his wallet, and his fortress. The response was instantaneous and brutal. Calith's legal team, a phalanx of razor-sharp attorneys from a top-tier firm, descended like vultures. They filed a counter-motion painting Nivara as emotionally volatile and mentally unstable, citing her erratic behavior, which they defined as her crying after being thrown out, and her history of artistic temperament as reasons she was an unfit mother and an unreliable narrator. They even included a sworn declaration from Calith's housekeeper, a woman who had always been kind to Nivara, stating that Mrs. Draven often seemed melancholy and detached. It was a character assassination designed to isolate and intimidate her. Reading the documents in Thalen's office, Nivara felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "They're twisting everything," she whispered, her hands shaking. "They make me sound like a crazy person." "This is the Draven playbook," Thalen said calmly, pushing a glass of water towards her. "Step 1, discredit the victim. They want you to get emotional, to get angry, to call that housekeeper and scream at her. They want you to prove them right. We're not going to give them the satisfaction." The first hearing was set for 2 weeks later. It was a lifetime. In the interim, Nivara existed in a state of suspended animation. Leora was her rock, forcing her to eat, to walk, to breathe. She even cleared out a corner of her cluttered apartment and set up Nivara's old easel and some paints. "You need to remember who you are, Niv," Leora had said. "You're not just his wife or his ex-wife. You're an artist. Go make something, even if it's just angry scribbles." At first, Nivara couldn't. The creative spark felt extinguished, buried under layers of grief and anxiety. But one afternoon, fueled by a fresh wave of fury after reading another condescending legal filing, she picked up a brush. She didn't paint anything beautiful. She painted the feeling of being trapped in her car, the blurred city lights, the oppressive weight of the rain. She painted the cold, empty rooms of the mansion. She used dark, angry colors, charcoal, deep indigo, a violent slash of crimson. It was raw and messy and painful, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of her old self. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and overcast. Nivara dressed carefully, not in the designer clothes Calith had bought her, but in a simple professional maternity dress Leora had helped her find at a consignment shop. She wanted to look like a mother, not a cast-off socialite. The courtroom was an intimidating space of dark wood and high ceilings. Calith was already there, sitting beside his lead attorney, a formidable woman named Victoria Finch. He looked impeccable in a tailored suit, his face a mask of calm confidence. He didn't look at Nivara. He was deliberately ignoring her, treating her as an irrelevance. The power play was suffocating. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, Judge Serene Ithor, known for her sharp mind and intolerance for courtroom theatrics. Victoria Finch spoke first, her voice smooth and polished. She painted a picture of Calith as a long-suffering husband, a man who had tried to accommodate his wife's instability, but was ultimately forced to create distance for his own well-being. She argued that Nivara's demand for the house was punitive, and that the generous but unspecified settlement Calith was prepared to offer was more than sufficient. Then it was Thalen's turn. He didn't grandstand. He spoke quietly, methodically. He presented the facts. A 9-month pregnant woman, locked out of her home and her bank accounts, sleeping on a friend's couch. He presented her declined credit card statements. He presented the notification for the nursery designer. "Your Honor," Thalen said, his voice resonating with quiet conviction. "This is not about punishment. This is about stability. A child is about to be born. That child deserves to be brought into a stable home, the only home he was ever meant to know. Mr. Draven has his penthouse, his hotels, his limitless resources. Mrs. Draven has nothing. We are asking the court to provide a safe and stable environment for this child, and to ensure that his father, a man with a net worth in the billions, provides for his basic needs." He didn't attack Calith's character. He appealed to the judge's sense of decency and her duty to the unborn child. Judge Aethor looked from Thalen to Calith. Her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Draven," she said, her voice sharp, "is it true that you have denied your wife access to all marital funds?" Calith shifted uncomfortably. Victoria Finch started to stand, but the judge waved her down. "I'm asking your client." Calith stood, the picture of composure. "Your Honor, I have taken steps to protect the marital assets from my wife's erratic impulses. I have every intention of providing for her and the child through a structured settlement. A settlement that has not yet been offered or agreed upon," the judge countered. "So, in the interim, your pregnant wife is, for all intents and purposes, destitute. Is that correct?" "That is a dramatic oversimplification," Calith began. "It's a yes or no question, Mr. Draven." The silence in the courtroom was electric. Calith's mask of confidence finally cracked. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Yes," he said. The word clipped. Judge Aethor nodded, her face grim. "I see." She looked through the filings. "I am granting the plaintiff's motion for temporary relief. Mr. Draven will immediately restore Mrs. Draven's access to all joint accounts. He will pay Mr. Morris's retainer from those funds, and he will vacate the marital residence within 48 hours. Mrs. Draven is granted exclusive use of the home until this matter is settled. We will address a formal support structure at our next hearing." A collective gasp went through Calith's legal team. Calith himself looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face was pale with fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the table. He had lost. The first round, decisively, was hers. He finally looked at Nivara. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a look of pure, venomous hatred. It was a look that promised war. Nivara met his gaze, her heart pounding, but she did not look away. She felt Thalen's hand briefly touch her arm, a gesture of support. She had won. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a foothold. She had a home again. She had resources. She had a voice. As she walked out of the courtroom, the city air felt different. The fog was lifting. For the first time since that rainy night, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face. The war was just beginning, but she had survived the first battle, and she was ready for the next one. Returning to the Atherton mansion was one of the strangest experiences of Nivara's life. It was a homecoming and an invasion all at once. The security guards Calith had hired to lock her out were the same ones who now had to stand by, their faces impassive as Thalen Moritz presented them with the court order. The heavy oak door swung open, and Nivara stepped inside. The house was exactly as she had left it, but it felt completely different. The air was stale, sterile. Calith's presence lingered like a ghost, in the scent of his cologne in the master bedroom, the half-empty whiskey glass still on the bar. It was his house, his kingdom, and now, by order of the court, it was hers. The first thing she did was walk through every room, a queen surveying her conquered territory. She went into his immaculate office, with its panoramic view of the valley. His desk was clear, his files gone. He had scrubbed his presence clean. Then she went to the nursery. The door was closed. She pushed it open and her heart ached. The room was empty. The crib, the changing table, the hand-painted mobile, all of it was gone. He had packed it all away, erasing not just her, but the very idea of their child from the house. The cruelty was so profound, so petty, it solidified her resolve. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a psychological one. With Leora's help, Nivara began the slow process of reclaiming the space. They opened all the windows, letting the fresh California air chase out the sterile chill. They packed up Calith's clothes, his books, his personal effects, and had them sent to his penthouse. They replaced his cold, abstract art with Nivara's own vibrant, emotional canvases. The house began to breathe again. The nursery was the hardest part. Staring at the empty room felt like a constant reminder of Calith's rejection. So she decided to repaint it herself. Armed with rollers and a gallon of warm, sunny yellow paint, she spent a weekend transforming the space. As she painted, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. With each stroke, she was covering up the past, creating a new, bright future for her son. She was no longer waiting for a designer to create a perfect room. She was building it with her own two hands. Meanwhile, the legal war raged on. Calith's team, stung by their initial defeat, doubled down. They buried Thalen in discovery requests, demanding every email, text message, and diary entry Nivara had ever written. They were searching for any ammunition they could use to paint her as unstable. It was during this process that Nivara made a pivotal discovery. Thalen had asked her to go through her old laptops and phones for any communication related to the prenup or their finances. One rainy afternoon, sitting in the vast living room that was now hers, she was combing through an old backup of her laptop. She found a folder labeled House Plans from when they were first building the mansion. It was filled with architectural drawings, invoices, and correspondence. Tucked away in a subfolder, she found something else: audio files. Calith had a habit of using a voice recorder to dictate notes and reminders. He had apparently, and carelessly, backed them up to the same shared drive. Most were mundane. Remind Richard to short the tech stock. Schedule a tea time at Pebble Beach. But then she found one file that made her blood run cold. It was dated almost a year before he'd kicked her out. Calith's voice was crisp and clear. "Note to self," he began. "Met with Finch today regarding the Sterling Nash preliminary talks. The key person clause is going to be a sticking point. They want stability, a squeaky clean image. No distractions. The Nivara situation needs a long-term strategy. The prenup is a good firewall, but a divorce during the merger is too risky. It has to be handled before the final negotiations. Needs to be clean, irreconcilable differences. No fault. The key is to provoke a situation where she leaves, make it her choice, or at least make it look that way. Control the narrative. Nivara listened to it 3 times, her heart pounding in her ears. It was the smoking gun. A premeditated plot to dispose of her for business purposes. The casual cruelty of it, the cold, strategic way he referred to her as the Nivara situation, was devastating. He had never loved her. She had been a chess piece in a game she didn't even know she was playing. She immediately called Thalen. "I think I found something," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of horror and vindication. "Something big." She emailed him the file. The silence on the other end of the line as he listened was profound. "My God," he finally breathed. "He's not just a monster, he's an idiot. To record something like this, the sheer arrogance." "What does this mean?" Nivara asked. "This means everything," Thalen said, a new energy in his voice. "This isn't just leverage, Nivara. This is a nuke. This recording proves fraudulent inducement for the entire marriage. It proves his filings about your instability are perjurious. If this gets out, it won't just tank his merger. It could trigger an SEC investigation. It could destroy him." The power dynamic had shifted, fundamentally and irrevocably. Before, they were fighting for a fair settlement. Now they were holding the key to Kaleth's entire empire. "What do we do?" she asked. "We don't do anything. Not yet," Thalen said, his mind clearly racing. "We hold this. We continue with our discovery. We let him think he's still in control. We let him continue to underestimate you. And then, at the perfect moment, we show him our hand. And we don't just ask for a settlement. We ask for everything." Hanging up the phone, Nivara looked around the magnificent house. It was no longer just a place to live. It was a fortress. It was her command center. The fear and grief that had haunted her for weeks were finally gone, burned away by the cold fire of purpose. She was no longer the victim. She was the queen in the castle, and she was about to checkmate the king. With the secret recording in their arsenal, Thalen and Nivara's strategy shifted from defense to a quiet, calculated offense. They were no longer reacting to Kaleth's moves. They were setting a trap. On the surface, they continued the tedious dance of legal discovery, responding to Kaleth's team's endless requests and filing their own. But underneath, every move was designed to tighten the psychological screws on Kaleth. Thalen's requests became surgically precise. He subpoenaed the personal travel records of Kaleth and a specific female executive at Sterling Nash, a woman named Serafina Hayes. He requested all communication related to the key person clause in the merger agreement. He was building a case around the recording without revealing the recording itself, creating a web of evidence that would corroborate the audio file when they finally chose to deploy it. Nivara, meanwhile, played her part perfectly. She was no longer just a client. She was a partner in the strategy. She began to live her life in the mansion with a quiet, defiant grace that she knew would infuriate Kaleth. Paparazzi, undoubtedly tipped off by Kaleth's PR team to catch her looking disheveled, would occasionally camp outside the gates. Instead of hiding, Nivara would emerge, serene and radiant in her late pregnancy, to water the flowers in the garden. She didn't speak to them, but her calm, dignified presence was a more powerful statement than any words. She was the wronged wife, patiently waiting for justice, living in the castle he had built. The narrative was slipping from his control. She also started painting again, with a ferocity she hadn't felt since art school. The vast, empty living room became her studio. She worked on a massive canvas, a portrait of a woman, her face half in shadow, half in light, with a storm raging in the background. It was a self-portrait of her own transformation. The pressure was clearly getting to Kaleth. His lawyer's filings became more aggressive, more desperate. They accused Nivara of squandering marital assets when she bought a new crib and baby supplies. They filed a motion to have her psychologically evaluated. Judge Ithor denied it. noting that Mrs. Draven seemed markedly more stable than when she first appeared in her court. The true turning point came from an unexpected source. Nivara remembered Calith mentioning a private, off-the-books ledger he kept. He'd bragged about it once, late at night after too much wine, calling it his rainy day fund, a complex system of offshore accounts and shell corporations, where he hid personal assets from his business partners and, as it turned out, the IRS. He'd shown her where he kept the access codes, on a password-protected drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book in his office. A first edition of The Art of War. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Another example of his paranoia and arrogance. Now it was a potential key to everything. She found the book, still on the shelf in the office she had claimed. Her hands trembled as she opened it and found the small, disguised flash drive. She called Thalen immediately. "I think I have his rainy day fund," she said. Thalen's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Nivara, do not access it. Do not plug that into any computer connected to the internet. That's his private domain. If we access it illegally, any evidence on it becomes inadmissible. We'd be handing him a weapon to use against us." "So what do we do?" she asked, her frustration mounting. "We know he's hiding millions and we can't touch it?" "We don't touch it," Thalen said, his voice taut with excitement. "We make him give it to us. In our next round of discovery requests, I'm going to ask for any and all records of personal assets, including those held in non-traditional or offshore accounts. I'll even name a couple of the shell corporations you remember him mentioning. He will, under penalty of perjury, have to either produce that ledger or lie to the court. His lawyers will advise him to stonewall, to claim the request is a fishing expedition. And then, Thalen said, we play the tape. The strategy was brilliant. They would corner him, forcing him to lie under oath, and then expose the lie with the audio recording. The recording would not only prove he'd committed perjury regarding the hidden assets, but it would also validate the central claim of their case, that the entire divorce was a fraudulent, premeditated act. The day of the deposition arrived. It was held in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. Nivara was there, silent and observant, sitting beside Thalen. Calith sat opposite them, flanked by Victoria Finch and 2 junior associates. He looked tired, the strain showing in the tight lines around his mouth. For hours, Thalen questioned him about his finances. Calith was a master of evasion, answering every question with carefully worded non-answers. Then Thalen leaned forward. "Mr. Draven, are you familiar with a corporate entity known as Ethelred Holdings, LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands?" A flicker of panic in Calith's eyes. He looked at Finch, who gave a slight shake of her head. "I am not," Calith said, his voice flat. "Are you familiar with the Vespasian Trust?" Thalen continued. "No. So to be clear, you are stating, under oath, that you have no knowledge of and hold no assets in any offshore accounts, including but not limited to those entities?" "That is correct," Calith said, his jaw tight. Thalen paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He looked at Nivara, who gave a barely perceptible nod. This was the moment. "Mr. Draven," Thalen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A year ago, did you make a voice recording outlining your strategy to provoke a situation where your wife would leave you in order to protect your merger with Sterling Nash?" The color drained from Calith's face. Victoria Finch shot to her feet. "Objection! This is baseless and inflammatory. Where is this ridiculous accusation coming from?" Thalen ignored her, his eyes locked on Calith. "Did you or did you not state that the Nivara situation needed to be handled before final negotiations, and that the key was to control the narrative?" Calith was speechless. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. He knew, in that instant, that they had him. The carefully constructed walls of his empire were about to come crashing down. Thalen reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder. He placed it on the table between them. It wasn't the real recording, just a prop, but the effect was devastating. "We can play the tape for you, if it would refresh your memory," Thalen offered, his voice laced with ice. "Or perhaps you'd like to reconsider your previous testimony regarding your hidden assets, because the same recording contains some very interesting details about your rainy day fund." The siege was over. The fortress had been breached. Calith Draven, the master of the universe, was trapped. He looked at Nivara, truly looked at her for the first time that day. The woman he saw was not the weeping, broken girl he had thrown out into the rain. This was a stranger, a woman with eyes of steel who had patiently and brilliantly engineered his complete and utter ruin. The deposition ended abruptly. Victoria Finch requested a recess, her professional composure shattered, and practically dragged a pale, shell-shocked Calith out of the room. The air in the conference room, once thick with tension, now felt strangely light. Nivara felt a tremor run through her body, the release of months of pent-up fear and anger. She had done it. She had faced the dragon in his lair and had not been burned. "What happens now?" she asked Thalen, her voice barely a whisper. "Now," Thalen said, allowing himself a small, grim smile. "We wait for the surrender." It didn't take long. The next morning, Thalen received a call. Not from Victoria Finch, but from Calith's senior partner, a man who was clearly in damage control mode. They wanted to settle. Immediately. Quietly. The negotiation took place not in a lawyer's office, but in the Lion's Den itself, the living room of the Atherton mansion. It was Nivara's non-negotiable condition. She wanted him to face her in the home he had tried to rip away from her, surrounded by the life he had discarded. Calith arrived with just one lawyer, a different one this time, a specialist in high-stakes crisis management. He looked diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle, resentful tension. He avoided looking at Nivara, his eyes darting around the room, taking in her paintings that now hung on his walls. Nivara sat in a large armchair, her 9-month belly a prominent symbol of everything he had tried to deny. Thalen sat beside her, a folder in his lap. Leora had insisted on being there, too, standing quietly by the fireplace, a silent, protective sentinel. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," Calith's new lawyer began. "My client is prepared to make a very generous offer to resolve this matter amicably." He slid a proposal across the coffee table. It was a significant sum of money, a multi-million-dollar settlement that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Thalen didn't even look at it. He pushed it back. "We're not interested in your client's definition of generosity," he said coolly. "Here is our offer." He opened his folder and handed a single sheet of paper to the lawyer. The room was silent as the lawyer read it. His eyebrows shot up. He read it again, then handed it to Calith with a look of disbelief. Calith's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red as he scanned the page. He looked up, his eyes finally locking with Nivara's. The hatred in them was pure. "This is insane," he hissed. "This is extortion." "No," Nivara said, her voice steady and clear. It was the first time she had spoken. "This is a reckoning." Their demands were simple, brutal, and absolute. First, the audio recording and the flash drive containing his offshore ledger would be placed in a secure vault, with a copy held by a third party. If Calith ever breached any term of their agreement, the contents would be delivered to the SEC and the board of Sterling Nash. It was a sword of Damocles that would hang over his head for the rest of his life. Second, Nivara would receive 50% of all declared marital assets, as was her right under California law. But in addition, she would receive 75% of the undeclared assets from the Rainy Day Fund, a sum that dwarfed their known wealth. Third, and most importantly, the Atherton Mansion. The title would be transferred to her, free and clear. It was not to be part of the asset division. It was separate, it was punitive, it was symbolic. "You want the house?" Calith sneered, a desperate, ugly sound. "What are you going to do with it? You can't afford the taxes, the upkeep. You'll be bankrupt in a year." "That's my concern, not yours," Nivara replied calmly. "You built this house as a monument to your power, Calith, a place to show the world you had arrived. Now, it will be a monument to your downfall. Every time you read about me, every time you see a picture, you will be reminded that I am living in the house you paid for, raising the son you abandoned." The psychological blow was more damaging than any financial penalty. She wasn't just taking his money, she was taking his legacy. She was seizing the very symbol of his identity. "And one more thing," Thalen added, his voice like silk. "The child. Mr. Draven will relinquish all parental rights. He will have no contact, no visitation. His name will not be on the birth certificate. He will, however, be responsible for all of the child's expenses, health, education, everything, until the age of 25, paid into a trust managed solely by Mrs. Solon. He will pay for a son he will never know." This was the final, devastating blow. Calith had treated their child as a liability to be managed. Now, he would be nothing more than a funding source, an anonymous benefactor to a life he had no part in. Calith stared at her, his mind clearly reeling, searching for an angle, a countermove. But there was none. She had him cornered, checkmated by his own arrogance and cruelty. The choice was simple: accept these terms, or face total annihilation. His merger, his company, his freedom, all of it was on the line. He looked at his lawyer, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only move left on the board. Calith slumped in his chair, a broken man. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. "Fine," he whispered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "You win." "This was never a game," Nivara said, standing up slowly, her hand on her belly. She was no longer afraid of him. She felt nothing for him at all, not love, not hate, just a vast, empty pity. "It was about my son, and ensuring he would never, ever be subjected to a man like you." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him there in the shell of his former kingdom. She didn't look back. She walked towards the nursery, the one she had painted with her own hands, and felt the baby kick, a strong, steady rhythm. The reckoning was over. It was time for the rebirth. The weeks following the settlement were a whirlwind of legal paperwork and quiet transformation. True to his word, Calith disappeared. The transfer of assets was handled with cold, robotic efficiency by his lawyers. The title to the mansion was signed over. A trust fund of staggering size was established for a boy named Baby Draven, soon to be Baby Solon. The name on the account was the only connection Calith would ever have to his son. Nivara walked through the grand rooms of the mansion, but the ghost of Calith was gone. It no longer felt like his house. The cold, imposing spaces were now filled with her life. Her paintings, vibrant and full of emotion, hung in every room. The sterile silence was replaced by the soft sounds of classical music, and soon, the cries and coos of a newborn. 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, Nivara went into labor. Leora was by her side, a constant, reassuring presence. She gave birth to a healthy, beautiful boy with a tuft of dark hair and his mother's determined eyes. She named him Arian. Arian, the lion, for his strength and for hers. Holding him for the first time in the quiet of the hospital room, Nivara felt a wave of love so profound it washed away the last remnants of her pain and anger. This tiny, perfect human was the reason for it all. The fight, the fear, the struggle. It had all been to bring him safely into the world, into a life free from his father's toxic shadow. Her redemption wasn't in owning the mansion or controlling the money. Her redemption was here, in her arms. The wealth was just a tool, a means to an end. It was the security that would allow her to raise her son without fear, to give him every opportunity, to focus on being his mother, without the constant worry of survival. In the months that followed, Nivara settled into her new life. She hired a small, trusted staff to help manage the house, but she remained hands-on. She learned about finances, about investments, working with a patient advisor Thalen had recommended. She was no longer intimidated by the world of money. She saw it for what it was, a resource to be managed wisely. She also started a foundation. The Nivara Solon Foundation was dedicated to providing legal aid and temporary housing for women and children fleeing domestic abuse, particularly those trapped in financially controlling relationships. She used the story of her own escape, the night in the car, the locked bank accounts, as a quiet inspiration. She never named Caliph, but she didn't have to. Her work was her statement. One sunny afternoon, about a year later, she was in the garden with Arian, who was now taking his first wobbly steps on the lush green lawn. The garden was her sanctuary, a place she had replanted with vibrant flowers and fragrant herbs. As Arian giggled and chased a butterfly, Nivara saw a car slow down outside the gates. It was a sleek, black sedan she recognized. Through the iron bars, she could see Caliph in the passenger seat. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at her, at the son he would never know. His face was a mixture of curiosity, regret, and a deep, hollow longing. He looked older, tired. The Sterling Nash merger had gone through, but the industry papers whispered that he had lost his edge, his ruthless spark. He had won his prize, but he had lost his soul. Nivara met his gaze for a moment. Then she turned away, picked up her son, and held him close, burying her face in his soft hair. She felt no anger, no triumph, just a quiet, profound peace. He had kicked her out, pregnant and alone, to sleep in her car. Now she owned his mansion. But it wasn't the house that was her victory. The victory was the life she had built inside it, a life of love, purpose, and freedom. She had inherited his kingdom, but she had done it by building her own, and that was an empire he could never touch. The car drove away, and Nivara didn't watch it go. She was too busy looking at her son, at the future, at the beautiful sun-drenched world she had created for them both. Nivara's journey from a mansion to a car and back again is a powerful testament to the fact that true strength isn't built in comfort. It's forged in fire. She didn't just win back a fortune, she won back her soul, building an empire of purpose on the ashes of betrayal. Her story reminds us that our lowest moments can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs, and that the most valuable asset we will ever own is our own resilience. What part of Nivara's fight for survival and justice inspired you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of incredible strength resonated with you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more unforgettable stories of betrayal and redemption, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload.